My mother sent a group text 2 days before Thanksgiving telling me not to come because my sister's new husband thought my presence would ruin the vibe. I did not reply. I did not cry. Instead, I simply smiled and looked at the confidential corporate merger file on my desk, the file that contained the names of everyone getting fired on Monday. His name was right at the top. My name is Nadia, and I am 34 years old. If you have ever been cut out by your own family just because someone with a loud mouth and a flashy watch walked into their lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe because you are going to want to hear how I served my family the ultimate slice of humble pie. It was a Tuesday evening when my phone lit up on the kitchen island of my Chicago penthouse. I was pouring myself a glass of Cabernet after a grueling 12-hour day at the firm. The notification was from our family group chat. A message from my mother, Brenda. Nadia, we decided it is best if you sit out Thanksgiving this year. DeAndre just got a huge promotion to regional vice president, and we want to celebrate. He feels your energy is just too negative and competitive. We will send you some leftovers. I stood there in the quiet of my kitchen, the city lights glowing through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I had hosted Thanksgiving for the last 6 years. I paid for the turkey, the decorations, and the wine. Now I was being uninvited from my own family holiday through a cowardly text message. Before I could process the audacity, a second message popped up. This one was from my younger sister, Sienna. Sorry, not sorry, Nadia. DeAndre is taking us all to a private resort for the weekend anyway to celebrate his new title. He makes real money now. Maybe if you focused less on your spreadsheets and more on finding a man, you would not be so bitter all the time. Enjoy your television dinners. My father Thomas even chimed in with a thumbs-up emoji to Sienna's cruel message. They were all in on it. I took a slow sip of my wine. Real money. I almost laughed out loud in the empty room. 5 years ago, I sat in my previous apartment and wrote a cashier's check for $40,000. I used my entire annual bonus to pay off Sienna's defaulted student loans so she would not get sued by the federal government and have her wages garnished. She cried on my shoulder that night, calling me her savior. Now she was tossing me aside for a guy who bought her a couple of designer bags. My parents always wanted a golden child to show off to their suburban friends. When Sienna married DeAndre, an African-American man with a silver tongue, a leased Mercedes, and an absolute obsession with flexing his lifestyle on social media, they practically worshipped the ground he walked on. He was loud. He bought them expensive dinners, and he made sure everyone knew exactly how successful he supposedly was. I was the exact opposite. I am a quiet, fiercely private woman. They knew I worked in corporate finance, but they assumed I was just a mid-level paper pusher crunching numbers in a tiny cubicle. I never corrected them because I never felt the need to explain my net worth to people who only called me when they needed cash. I set my phone face down on the cold marble counter. I did not type out an angry paragraph demanding respect. I did not call my mother to beg for my seat at the table. I walked over to my home office, sat down in my leather chair, and opened my laptop. I am the Senior Director of Mergers and Acquisitions Integration for one of the largest holding companies in the Midwest. My job is highly classified and incredibly ruthless. I am the person who comes in after a company is bought out to absorb their assets, restructure their management, trim the excess corporate fat, and fire the deadweight. It requires a cold heart and a strategic mind. Luckily, my family had trained me well in being cold. I opened the encrypted portfolio for the corporate acquisition taking place first thing Monday morning. The ink on the buyout contract had just dried that afternoon. The target company was Apex Media. I scrolled past the financial summaries and clicked directly on the restructuring roster. I needed to look at the list of redundant management personnel slated for immediate termination. My eyes scanned the spreadsheet until they locked onto the regional sales department. There it was, DeAndre Washington, Regional Vice President. I leaned back in my chair and smiled in the dark room. The same man who banished me from my own family dinner was about to walk into a boardroom expecting to demand a massive raise from his new corporate overlords. He had no idea the overlord was the sister-in-law he just threw away. You can enjoy your private resort and your Thanksgiving turkey this weekend, DeAndre. Because come Monday morning, I am going to show you exactly what real money looks like. Thursday morning arrived with a quiet stillness that usually only belongs to snowstorms and major holidays. While the rest of the country was busy stressing over dry stuffing and forced conversations with relatives they barely tolerated, I was sitting at my custom oak desk with a double shot of espresso. The panoramic view of Lake Michigan from my floor-to-ceiling windows was gray and turbulent, matching the storm I was about to bring down on Apex Media. I did not feel a single ounce of sadness about being excluded. The Thanksgiving void my mother assumed would crush my spirits was actually the most productive holiday I had experienced in years. I spent the entire afternoon going line by line through Apex Media financial disclosures. As the senior director of integration, I needed to know every single vulnerability of the company we just bought. Around 4 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed on the desk. It was an alert from Instagram. Sienna was broadcasting live. Against my better judgment, I tapped the notification. I needed to see exactly how much of a fool my brother-in-law was making of himself. The screen illuminated with Sienna's heavily filtered face. She was standing in the private dining room of a high-end resort holding a glass of champagne. Her designer dress looked brand new and incredibly expensive. "Hey everyone!" Sienna cooed into the camera, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "Just wanted to wish you all a happy Thanksgiving from the most gorgeous resort in Aspen." DeAndre surprised us with a weekend getaway to celebrate his massive promotion. I am so blessed to have a husband who actually provides and prioritizes family. She flipped the camera to show the dining table. It was absurdly lavish. At the center sat a glistening bird covered in dark shavings. "This is a $400 truffle-infused turkey," Sienna bragged, zooming in on the ridiculous dish. Some people are probably sitting at home right now eating frozen dinners and staring at spreadsheets because they cannot keep a man. But not us. We know how to live. The dig was so obvious it was pathetic. She was broadcasting to her few thousand followers, but the message was aimed entirely at me. I watched as the viewer count ticked up. My parents were in the background of the video holding their own champagne glasses and laughing loudly. DeAndre stepped into the frame wearing a cashmere sweater that easily cost $1,000. He wrapped an arm around Sienna and kissed her cheek, playing the role of the perfect affluent patriarch. I glanced down at the comments section, scrolling at the bottom of the screen. My father Thomas had just typed a message from his account. "So proud of my son-in-law. The son I never had. You earned this luxury, DeAndre." I felt a brief, sharp sting in my chest. Not because I wanted to be the son he never had, but because I knew exactly how my father had struggled to pay off his own mortgage last year. I knew my parents were living on a fixed retirement income, yet they were sitting in a luxury resort, worshipping a man who was entirely built on a mountain of financial smoke and mirrors. I took a deep breath and let the sting fade. Emotions do not win corporate buyouts. Facts do. I was about to close the application when something in the background of the video caught my eye. The live stream was still running and Sienna had turned the camera back to herself to read comments. Behind her, DeAndre was standing at the edge of the dining room talking to a resort manager. The manager was holding a leather billfold, clearly presenting the check for their lavish private dinner and the $400 turkey. I paused the video. I maximized the screen on my laptop and enhanced the brightness. DeAndre was reaching into his designer wallet. He pulled out a sleek, heavy black metal card and handed it to the manager. It was not an American Express. It was not a personal Chase Sapphire. It had a very distinct geometric silver logo stamped on the top right corner. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart rate picking up slightly. I knew that logo. I had spent the last 8 hours staring at that exact same logo on the financial documents spread across my desk. It was the corporate card issued strictly to Apex Media executives. My mind started racing. Corporate expense accounts are meticulously regulated, especially during a buyout transition. Executives are authorized to use those cards for client dinners, travel, and business operations. They are absolutely not authorized to use them to buy $400 truffle turkeys for their in-laws at a luxury resort in Aspen. I grabbed my mouse and immediately logged into the secure portal for the merger. I had full administrative access to Apex Media internal accounting network. I pulled up the real-time expense ledger for the regional sales department. I cross-referenced DeAndre Washington employee identification number. The screen loaded for a few seconds before generating his transaction history. Right there at the very top of the list was a pending charge for $6,800 at the St. Regis Aspen Resort, tagged under the category of client entertainment. I sat back in my chair and let out a soft laugh. DeAndre was not just arrogant, he was incredibly stupid. He had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy him. Monday morning arrived with a crisp bite in the Chicago air. I stepped out of my town car and looked up at the towering glass and steel structure of my corporate headquarters. The building was an imposing monolith of power, reflecting the kind of ruthless business we conducted inside. Today, Apex Media was officially absorbed into our portfolio. Today, the arrogant executives who thought they were invincible would face the harsh reality of a corporate takeover. I swiped my Platinum Access badge at the private elevator and rode directly to the top floor in total silence. My corner office was already prepped for the day. My assistant had left a fresh black coffee and the finalized acquisition binders on my desk. I sat down, took a sip of the bitter coffee, and opened the master personnel file for Apex Media. The restructuring phase is always the most brutal part of my job. We buy bloated companies, strip away the useless management layers, and streamline operations for maximum profit. That inevitably means people lose their jobs, and I am the one who pulls the trigger. I flipped to the spreadsheet labeled Immediate Terminations. There were 42 names on the list. Right in the middle, highlighted in standard corporate red, was DeAndre Washington. His performance metrics were mediocre at best. His regional sales division had been bleeding revenue for 3 consecutive quarters, yet his personal expense reports were astronomical. Under normal circumstances, I would simply sign my name at the bottom of the page, hand the file to Human Resources, and let security escort him out of the building by noon. It would be an entirely clinical and detached process. But after the Thanksgiving stunt, and after seeing him blatantly use company funds to buy a luxury turkey and designer clothes for my sister Clinical was no longer an option. I wanted to look him in the eye. I wanted him to understand exactly who held his fate in her hands. I dragged my mouse across his name, unchecked the immediate termination box, and moved him to the mandatory executive review roster. Keeping him on the active employee list meant he had to attend the morning transition meeting with the new senior management. The trap was officially set. I spent the next hour reviewing the forensic audit I ordered on his corporate card over the weekend. The Thanksgiving dinner was just the tip of the iceberg. There were charges for luxury car rentals, high-end spa days, and lavish dinners at restaurants Sienna frequented. He had been treating his corporate expense account like a personal trust fund, leaving a massive digital trail. I printed the entire ledger, placed it inside a sleek black folder, and tucked it under my arm. At exactly 8:45, I walked down the long hallway toward the main executive boardroom. The space was specifically designed to intimidate. It featured a massive mahogany table that seated 30 people, floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the city skyline and state-of-the-art presentation screens. I took my seat at the very head of the table. I placed my black folder down and folded my hands over it. The room was perfectly quiet. I instructed my assistant to hold all of my calls and lock the secondary doors. The only way in or out was through the primary double-glass doors at the far end of the room. The Apex Media management team was scheduled to arrive at 9 o'clock sharp for their briefing. They thought they were coming in to meet a team of faceless corporate suits. They thought they were going to negotiate their retention packages and secure their quarterly bonuses. The digital clock on the wall clicked to 9. I heard the distinct hum of the elevator arriving down the hall. Footsteps echoed on the marble floors, accompanied by the low murmur of nervous conversations. The Apex executives were approaching. Then a voice boomed louder than the rest. It was a voice I had heard all weekend on social media bragging about resorts and real money. "Listen to me, guys. We hold the leverage here," DeAndre was practically shouting to his colleagues as they neared the doors. "These new corporate overlords need us to keep the regional accounts running. Do not let them intimidate you. I am going in there and demanding a 20% salary increase and a larger expense account. If they want my talent, they have to pay for it. The heavy glass doors swung open. DeAndre strolled into the boardroom first. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit, a heavy gold watch flashing on his wrist, and carrying a cup of artisan coffee. He had a wide, arrogant smirk on his face, ready to conquer the room. DeAndre walked in like he owned the building. He took 3 confident strides past the threshold before his eyes finally landed on the head of the table. He stopped so abruptly that the executive behind him nearly bumped into his shoulder. The arrogant smirk on his face faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by genuine confusion. He blinked hard as if his eyes were playing tricks on him in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the corporate headquarters. Then the confusion vanished, and his signature arrogance flooded right back. He let out a loud booming laugh that echoed off the mahogany walls. "Nadia," he chuckled, shaking his head as if he had just witnessed a mildly amusing magic trick. "What in the world are you doing up here? Did you get lost on the way to the secretarial pool?" He looked back at his colleagues, inviting them to share in the joke. A few of them offered polite, nervous chuckles. They did not know who I was yet, but they knew DeAndre was the loudest voice in their regional office, and they instinctively followed his lead. They filed into the room, taking their seats, hesitantly clutching their leather briefcases. They could sense a strange, heavy tension in the air, even if DeAndre was entirely oblivious to it. Seriously, though, DeAndre continued. He walked toward the middle of the table and pulled out a heavy leather chair, but he did not sit down. Instead, he leaned his knuckles on the table, leaning forward in an attempt to tower over me. "I knew you worked in finance somewhere in the city, but I did not realize you were temping for the holding company. Are you here to take the meeting minutes? Or did they send you up to audit the petty cash?" He laughed again, highly entertained by his own wit. He adjusted his heavy gold watch, the one he bought using his corporate expense account, making sure everyone in the room noticed it. Before I could even open my mouth to respond, he waved his hand dismissively in my direction. "Actually, do me a favor. Go grab me a sparkling water. The transition team should be here any minute, and I want to be hydrated when I negotiate my new compensation package. I am not taking anything less than a 20% bump. Chop, chop, Nadia." I did not blink. I did not break eye contact. I let the silence stretch. In the corporate world, silence is a weapon. It makes the weak uncomfortable. I watched as the rest of the Apex media executives settled into their chairs. Their corporate survival instincts were beginning to kick in. The chief financial officer of Apex, an older man sitting 2 seats down from DeAndre, looked from DeAndre to me, his brow furrowing. He noticed the expensive cut of my tailored blazer. He noticed the thick confidential acquisition binders sitting neatly in front of me. He realized I was not a secretary. I kept my face entirely neutral. I rested my hands flat on the black folder containing DeAndre's fraudulent expense reports. Under the lip of the heavy mahogany table, my finger found the discreet silver button panel installed for executive security. I pressed the first button. A sharp, distinct electronic click echoed through the boardroom. The heavy glass doors sealed shut and locked automatically. Several executives turned their heads toward the sound, sudden unease washing over their faces. DeAndre finally stopped smiling. He looked at the doors, then back at me, a flicker of genuine irritation crossing his features. "What was that?" DeAndre snapped, his voice losing its playful edge. "Unlock the doors, Nadia. The senior management team needs to get in. You are going to get yourself fired playing games up here." I slowly stood up from my chair. I picked up the remote control resting next to my coffee cup and pointed it at the ceiling. The automated blinds on the floor-to-ceiling windows smoothly descended, plunging the room into a dramatic, cinematic dimness. The massive presentation screen behind me hummed to life, casting a bright, harsh white light over the faces of the 30 executives sitting at the table. "The senior management team is already here, DeAndre," I said. My voice was calm, perfectly modulated, and completely devoid of the familial warmth he was accustomed to exploiting. "Welcome to your acquisition briefing. I suggest everyone open the binders placed in front of you." I pressed the next button on the remote. The screen flashed. The new corporate organizational chart appeared in massive, undeniable letters. Right at the very top, reigning over the entire Apex Media integration process, was my professional headshot. Beneath it, in bold black font, read the words, Senior Vice President of Acquisitions. Beneath my title was a direct, solid red line connecting straight down to the regional management tier, terminating exactly at DeAndre's name. I was his direct supervisor. DeAndre stared at the massive screen. His jaw dropped open, but no sound came out. His fingers went entirely limp, and his cup of artisan coffee slipped from his grasp, shattering against the expensive marble floor. The coffee seeped into the grout of the expensive marble floor, a spreading dark stain, in the absolute silence of the boardroom. Nobody moved to clean it up. DeAndre stared at the glowing white letters on the massive projection screen, his eyes darting back and forth as if reading the words over and over would somehow change their meaning. The tension in the room was so thick, it felt like physical weight pressing down on the chest of every Apex Media executive sitting at the table. Then DeAndre did the only thing his fragile ego would allow him to do. He went into complete denial. He let out another laugh, but this one was high-pitched and forced. It was the desperate sound of a man trying to convince himself he was still in control. He looked around the table at his colleagues, holding his hands up in mock surrender. Okay, very funny, DeAndre said, his voice straining to fill the large room. I have to admit you got me. This is a great prank. Did my father-in-law set this up? I know you were mad about missing the turkey on Thursday, Nadia, but hacking the corporate presentation is a bit much, even for you. He turned to the chief financial officer sitting near him and playfully nudged the older man on the shoulder. This is my crazy sister-in-law, Nadia, he announced to the room, entirely abandoning any semblance of workplace professionalism. She is the black sheep of the family. She was a little upset that my wife and I did not invite her to our luxury Aspen getaway this weekend, so I guess this is her way of throwing a tantrum. Just ignore her, guys. Let us wait for the real senior vice president to show up so we can get this over with. The chief financial officer slowly pulled his shoulder away from DeAndre. The older executive looked from the meticulous, leather-bound acquisition binders in front of me to the unhinged, rambling man standing beside him. The horror slowly dawned on the faces of every Apex manager in the room. They were seasoned corporate veterans. They recognized the cold, sterile reality of a corporate takeover. They knew I was not a prank. They knew DeAndre was digging his own professional grave right in front of them, and they desperately wanted to be as far away from him as possible. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or acknowledge the personal insults. I simply opened the black folder resting under my hands. Please, take your seat, Mr. Washington, I said. My voice was icy, cutting through his nervous laughter like a scalpel. We are operating on a strict schedule, and I do not have the time to indulge your delusions. You are currently speaking to the Senior Vice President of Acquisitions. I am the executive who finalized the purchase of Apex Media, and as of 8:00 this morning, I am your direct supervisor. DeAndre stopped laughing. The blood drained from his face, leaving an ashen, sickly hue. He finally looked at me not as the sister-in-law he could bully, but as the corporate authority who held his entire livelihood. Since we are beginning the transition process, I continued flipping open the first page of the forensic audit. I am requiring an immediate line-by-line review of your third quarter financial disclosures. Specifically, I am formally requesting a full explanation for the severe irregularities found within your regional sales expense account. DeAndre gripped the back of his leather chair. What irregularities, he demanded, his voice dropping into a defensive-aggressive register. My numbers are solid. My department brings in revenue. You have no right to look at my expenses without the chief executive officer present. I looked up from the folder, meeting his panicked gaze. I am looking at a ledger that shows over $50,000 in unaccounted charges, labeled as client entertainment, Mr. Washington. These charges coincide perfectly with luxury car rentals, designer retail purchases, and a $400 dinner in Aspen on a federal holiday. This is not a family matter. This is corporate embezzlement, DeAndre snapped. The veneer of the polished executive shattered completely. He aggressively slammed his hand down flat on the mahogany table, rattling the water glasses of the men sitting next to him. You listen to me, he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at my face. You are nothing but a bitter, lonely spinster who is jealous of my marriage. I am a regional vice president. I answer only to the chief executive officer of this holding company, not to some pathetic relative trying to play boss. I smoothly reached into the pocket of my binder. I pulled out a single sheet of heavy stock paper stamped with the official corporate seal. I slid the paper across the polished mahogany table until it stopped exactly in front of his trembling hand. Actually, DeAndre, I said softly, I am the one authorized to terminate your employment, and this is your official signed termination authorization form. DeAndre stared at the crisp white paper resting on the mahogany table. The bold black letters spelling out his termination seemed to finally break through his thick skull. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish pulled out of water. The arrogant swagger he carried into the room evaporated, leaving behind a terrified small man. He did not try to argue. He did not demand to speak to the chief executive officer. He snatched his leather briefcase from the floor, knocking his chair backward. The chair crashed onto the marble floor with a loud echo. DeAndre turned and stormed out of the boardroom without making eye contact. The doors clicked shut behind him. I calmly pulled the termination form back toward me and slipped it into my folder. I looked at the remaining Apex Media executives. Their postures were rigid. They had their pens and notebooks open, entirely ready to comply with whatever I demanded. I spent the next 2 hours dismantling their regional operations, setting the new corporate standards, and making it abundantly clear that any further financial misconduct would be met with immediate legal action. While I was meticulously restructuring the department, DeAndre was busy running his mouth. He did not go to his office to pack his belongings. He went to the parking garage and called my sister. I knew exactly what narrative he was spinning. He told Sienna I was a tyrant illegally harassing him and threatening his job purely out of jealousy. He claimed I was punishing him because I was bitter about their Thanksgiving getaway. Sienna, always playing the victim, immediately called the one person guaranteed to escalate the situation to maximum drama: our mother. By noon, I had wrapped up the acquisition briefing. I gathered my binders and rode the private elevator down to the main executive lobby to meet the legal team for lunch. The lobby is a quiet sanctuary of glass and polished steel filled with high-profile clients. But the serene atmosphere was violently shattered the moment the elevator doors opened. Nadia, the shrill, hysterical shriek bounced off the high ceilings. I stepped out of the elevator and saw my mother, Brenda, charging across the lobby. She bypassed the ground floor security desk by faking a medical emergency, claiming her daughter was having a crisis upstairs. Now she was the crisis. She was wearing a thick cashmere coat with a recognizable designer emblem on the lapel. Her face was flushed dark red with rage. "You vindictive, miserable excuse for a sister," Brenda screamed, not caring that heads were turning all over the lobby. Receptionists stopped answering phones. Senior partners paused their conversations to stare. I stood perfectly still, holding my leather binders, watching her storm toward me like a wild animal. DeAndre just called Sienna in tears, my mother yelled, stopping just a few feet away from me. She pointed a finger at my chest. "How dare you threaten his job? You are deliberately trying to ruin your sister's marriage because you cannot find a man of your own. You have always been insanely jealous of Sienna, but abusing your position to fire her husband is a new low even for you." I did not raise my voice. I did not match her hysterical energy. I simply looked at her with the same cold, analytical gaze I used in the boardroom. "You are trespassing in a private corporate facility, Mother," I said evenly. "I suggest you turn around and walk out before I have you arrested." My calm demeanor acted like gasoline on a fire. Brenda completely lost what little control she had left. Her eyes widened with fury. She raised her right hand high in the air, fully intending to slap me across the face in front of half the executive board. She never made contact. A large hand clamped firmly around her wrist in midair. My corporate security detail, who had been approaching the moment she started screaming, intercepted her arm. The tall security guard gently but firmly twisted her arm back down to her side, stepping directly between us. "Let go of me!" Brenda shrieked, struggling against the guard. I stepped closer to my mother. I looked her up and down, letting my eyes rest on the extravagant cashmere coat she was wearing. You should be very careful about making a scene right now, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet lobby. Because that beautiful designer coat you are wearing was purchased on October 12th using stolen company funds from my corporate accounts. I am not ruining Sienna's marriage. I am preparing to hand a federal indictment to her husband. And if you do not leave my lobby this exact second, I will have the police strip that stolen evidence right off your back. My mother froze. The blood that had rushed to her face only seconds ago drained away entirely, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very old. She looked down at the lapel of her cashmere coat as if it had suddenly caught fire. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The corporate security guard did not wait for her to find her voice. He placed a firm hand on her shoulder and guided her toward the revolving glass doors. I watched her stumble slightly as she was escorted out onto the busy Chicago sidewalk, her perfectly curated image of upper-middle-class superiority completely shattered in front of my colleagues and the entire executive floor. I did not feel a shred of guilt. I turned on my heels, smoothed my tailored blazer, and walked into the private dining room to meet my legal team for lunch. I ordered a dry martini and a rare steak. I had a feeling I was going to need the protein for the war that was about to begin. By the time I returned to my corner office at 1 in the afternoon, my personal cell phone was vibrating so violently against my desk it sounded like a drill. I picked it up and saw 73 unread notifications. My mother had not gone home to reflect on her actions or feel remorse for wearing stolen goods. She had gone to her car, opened the extended family group chat, and launched a full-scale nuclear strike against my character. I unlocked the screen and slowly scrolled through the barrage of messages. They were an absolute masterclass in manipulation and victim blaming. My Aunt Martha called me a corporate sociopath who had lost touch with basic human decency. My Uncle Greg sent a massive paragraph about how I was tearing the family apart out of sheer spite because I was jealous of Sienna and her beautiful marriage. Cousins I had not spoken to in over a decade were suddenly chiming in, calling me a monster, and demanding I apologize and reinstate DeAndre immediately. They accused me of abusing my corporate power to settle a petty sibling rivalry. The most pathetic attempt at intimidation came from my father. There was a 3-minute voicemail waiting for me. I pressed play and put the phone on speaker, letting his voice fill my quiet office. Thomas did not sound like a concerned parent. He sounded like a man who was terrified his financial meal ticket was about to be revoked. "Nadia, this is your father," the recording blared. "What you did to your mother in that lobby today is utterly unforgivable. DeAndre is a good man providing for your sister. If you do not drop this ridiculous vendetta and give him his job back by the end of the day, I am hiring a lawyer. I will sue you for intentional infliction of emotional distress and workplace harassment. You are an absolute disgrace to this family." I deleted the voicemail with a single tap. I did not type out a passionate defense in the family group chat. Arguing with people who are committed to misunderstanding you is a complete waste of valuable time and energy. Instead, I channeled every ounce of that frustration into my work. I picked up my desk phone and pressed the extension for the Director of Internal Audit. 10 minutes later, a sharp, incredibly thorough corporate investigator sat across from my desk. I handed him the preliminary file on DeAndre. "I want a deep dive forensic audit of every single account, vendor contract, and expense report DeAndre Washington has touched since he was hired at Apex Media," I instructed. "Pull his emails, pull his server logs, pull his travel itineraries. Leave no stone unturned. If he bought a pack of gum with company money, I want the receipt printed and placed on my desk." The investigator nodded, took the heavy file, and retreated to his department. I spent the next 4 hours ignoring my buzzing cell phone and finalizing the restructuring paperwork for the rest of the Apex staff. The sun was beginning to set over Lake Michigan, casting a dark orange glow into my office when there was a sharp knock at my door. The investigator walked back in. He did not look triumphant. He looked genuinely shocked by what he had uncovered. He placed a thick, freshly printed folder on my desk. "You were right to order the deep dive," he said quietly. "The luxury dinners and the designer clothes were just the surface-level mistakes. He has been running a massive vendor fraud scheme for the last 2 years." I opened the folder. The top page was a dense wire transfer log. DeAndre had created a fake marketing agency, billing Apex Media for high-level consulting services that never actually existed. He approved the fraudulent invoices himself using his regional authority. I traced the routing numbers on the spreadsheet. The shell company was not registered in his name. It was a limited liability company registered directly to Sienna. DeAndre had funneled over $120,000 of corporate marketing funds directly into my sister's personal bank account to fund her lavish influencer lifestyle. The next morning, at exactly 9 o'clock, I scheduled a formal disciplinary hearing in the Human Resources Department. I sat at the polished conference table next to our vice president of HR. We were waiting for DeAndre to surrender his company badge and sign the final offboarding documents. But when the frosted glass doors swung open, DeAndre was not holding his security badge. He was holding a leather briefcase, and he was not alone. He strutted into the room accompanied by a tall, aggressive-looking man in a custom pinstripe suit. The man threw a thick stack of legal papers onto the table with a loud thud. He introduced himself as Mr. Harrison, a senior partner at a high-profile employment law firm. DeAndre looked incredibly smug. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and shot me a triumphant glare. He actually thought he could intimidate me into backing down by bringing a hired gun. Before the vice president of HR could even formally open the meeting, the attorney launched into an aggressive monologue. He paced the length of the conference room, pointing an accusing finger in my direction. He claimed that the termination was completely baseless and driven by a toxic personal vendetta. He tossed around legal buzzwords with practiced ease, threatening us with a massive civil lawsuit for workplace harassment discrimination and a hostile work environment. My client has an immaculate track record of driving revenue for Apex Media, Mr. Harrison proclaimed loudly, slapping his hand against the mahogany table. What we have here is a clear-cut case of retaliation. A newly appointed corporate officer abusing her executive power to settle a petty family dispute. We are not just demanding my client be reinstated immediately with full back pay. We are demanding a public apology and a 7-figure settlement for the severe emotional distress inflicted upon him and his pregnant wife. DeAndre nodded along enthusiastically to every word. He looked at me as if he had already won the lottery. "Tell your father I said hello, Nadia." DeAndre sneered across the table. He was so confident that his loud lawyer had terrified the corporate HR department into absolute submission. I let the tense silence hang in the room for a long moment. I looked at the vice president of HR, who simply nodded at me, completely unbothered by the theatrical display. I did not argue with the attorney. I did not defend my character or try to explain the ridiculous Thanksgiving incident. I just reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out the thick, freshly printed forensic audit report. "I am afraid you have been severely misinformed by your client, Mr. Harrison," I said, keeping my voice completely level and devoid of emotion. "This termination has absolutely nothing to do with personal grievances. It is a strict matter of severe financial misconduct." I slid the heavy folder across the polished table. It stopped directly in front of the attorney. "I suggest you look closely at page 4, I added calmly. Mr. Harrison frowned, clearly annoyed by my lack of fear. He aggressively flipped the folder open. His eyes scanned the first page, likely expecting to see trivial expense disputes over hotel rooms or rental cars. But as he turned to page 4, the aggressive posturing completely vanished from his body. The color literally drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly pale. He was staring at the undeniable documented proof of wire fraud. He saw the routing numbers. He saw the fabricated invoices from the fake marketing agency. He saw the direct bank transfers linking Apex Media corporate funds straight to the personal bank account of Sienna Washington. It was a perfectly laid out paper trail of a major federal crime involving embezzlement, grand larceny, and corporate conspiracy. The lawyer swallowed hard. His eyes darted from the damning documents to DeAndre, who was still wearing his arrogant smirk, completely unaware of the radioactive legal bombs sitting on the table in front of them. "Is there a problem?" Harrison DeAndre asked, noticing the sudden shift in his lawyer's demeanor. "Just tell them we are taking this straight to court." Mr. Harrison did not say a word to his client. He carefully closed the folder and pushed it back across the table toward me, treating it like a loaded weapon. In the legal world, an attorney can defend a client against a wrongful termination suit, but an attorney cannot knowingly participate in the cover-up of an active federal felony without risking his own license and his freedom. Mr. Harrison quickly stood up from his chair. He grabbed his stack of legal threats from the table and shoved them recklessly back into his briefcase. He snapped the heavy latches shut with a loud, echoing click. "What are you doing?" DeAndre asked, his smirk faltering into a look of genuine confusion. Mr. Harrison picked up his briefcase and took 2 steps back from the table. "I cannot represent you," he said, his voice completely devoid of its former arrogance. He did not look at me. He looked directly at DeAndre with pure disgust. "You did not disclose the full nature of these financial transactions during our consultation. This firm handles civil employment disputes, not federal criminal defense. You need to find other legal counsel immediately." Without another word, the attorney turned on his heel and walked out of the conference room. The heavy glass doors swung shut. DeAndre was left sitting completely alone at the table, the color vanishing from his face as he stared at the closed door, realizing that no amount of loud talk could save him from the absolute ruin he had brought upon himself. I did not stay in the conference room to watch DeAndre process his impending doom. I simply gathered my folders and walked out, leaving him to face the devastating reality of his own actions. The rest of my workday was consumed by meetings with the legal department, finalizing the paperwork to hand the entire case file over to the federal authorities. By the time I finally returned to my penthouse that evening, the sun had long set over the Chicago skyline. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and sat on my velvet sofa, enjoying the quiet peace of my home. But that peace was abruptly shattered at 10:30 when the intercom buzzer echoed through the living room. I walked over to the security panel and looked at the video feed. Standing in the cold lobby of my high-rise building was my sister Sienna. She did not look like the glamorous influencer who had been bragging about truffle turkeys from Aspen just a few days ago. Her designer coat was thrown on hastily over loose sweatpants. Her hair was incredibly messy, and her mascara was purposely smudged under her eyes to make it look like she had been crying for hours. I knew exactly what she was doing. I pressed the button to unlock the lobby doors and waited by my front entrance. The elevator chimed, and Sienna practically collapsed into my hallway the moment I opened the door. She immediately launched into a hysterical performance, sobbing loudly and reaching out to grab my hands. "Nadia, please," she cried, forcing her voice to tremble violently. "You have to stop this. You have to bury that audit report." DeAndre came home looking like an absolute ghost. His lawyer quit, and he told me everything about the fake marketing agency. I had no idea he was doing anything illegal, I swear to you. I thought the money was just his executive bonus. "You cannot let him go to prison." I pulled my hands away from her grasp and crossed my arms firmly over my chest. "You are a registered co-owner of that shell company, Sienna," I replied coldly. "Do not insult my intelligence by playing the naive housewife. You knew exactly where those massive 6-figure deposits were coming from." Sienna dropped to her knees right there on my hardwood floor, playing her ultimate trump card. "I am pregnant," she wailed loudly, clutching her stomach. "I am pregnant with my second child, Nadia. Are you really going to send the father of your future niece or nephew to a federal penitentiary over some stupid corporate policy? We are sisters. Family is supposed to protect each other. You have the executive power to delete those server logs and make this whole thing disappear. Please, just wipe the files and let us walk away." I stared down at her, watching the highly theatrical tears stream down her face. It was the exact same performance she had used our entire lives to manipulate our parents into giving her whatever she wanted. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy. "You do not care about family, Sienna," I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady whisper. "You only care about funding your luxury lifestyle. You use fake crises to steal from people, just like you did 5 years ago when Grandma Dorothy passed away." Sienna flinched momentarily, breaking character. I pressed on, refusing to let her dodge the painful truth. "Grandma left a trust fund meant to be split evenly between us," I continued. "But you faked a massive financial crisis. You cried to mom and dad claiming you were going to be evicted and lose everything. You manipulated them into legally signing over my entire half of the inheritance to you so you could put a down payment on that ridiculous mansion you and DeAndre live in right now. You stole my inheritance to buy a house, and you did not even invite me to your housewarming party, so do not kneel in my home and preach to me about sisterhood. Sienna slowly stood up. The desperate sobbing stopped instantly, as if a switch had been flipped inside her head. She wiped the fake tears from her cheeks and smoothed the front of her expensive coat. The helpless victim facade completely melted away, revealing the vicious, entitled woman underneath. She glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "So you are really not going to help us?" she asked, her voice now completely flat and cold. "I will not commit a federal crime to save a thief," I answered, pointing directly toward my front door. "Get out of my penthouse." Sienna let out a sharp, bitter laugh and walked toward the exit. "You think you are so untouchable sitting up in your corporate tower?" she sneered, pausing with her hand on the doorknob. "You think you have won because you printed a few bank statements. But DeAndre is not going down without a fight. He knew you would act like a self-righteous snob. That is why he prepared a backup plan. Enjoy your quiet night, Nadia, because by tomorrow morning his new narrative is going to hit the press and it is going to completely destroy your career." She slammed the door behind her, leaving me standing in the silence. The door slammed with a finality that echoed through the long hallway of my penthouse. I did not run after her. I simply locked the deadbolt, turned off the lights, and went to sleep. I slept a full 8 hours, completely unbothered by the empty threats of a desperate woman. But when my alarm went off at exactly 6 o'clock the next morning, I realized Sienna was not entirely bluffing. DeAndre did have a backup plan, and it was a masterpiece of corporate manipulation. I picked up my phone from the nightstand. There were no messages from my mother or my aunts this time. Instead, there were 14 missed calls from my executive assistant and an urgent email from the vice president of public relations. The subject line simply read, "Industry Crisis Management Meeting immediately." I opened the email and clicked the attached link. It redirected me to one of the most prominent financial news blogs in the country. The headline was plastered across the top of the screen in bold, black letters. "Predatory Acquisitions: How One Corporate Giant Uses Family Blackmail to Gut Acquired Companies." I read the article while drinking my morning coffee. DeAndre had leaked a highly fabricated anonymous story to the press. He painted himself as a heroic corporate whistleblower. According to his narrative, he had discovered massive regulatory violations and illegal restructuring tactics being used by our holding company during the Apex Media buyout. He claimed that when he threatened to expose these violations to the federal authorities, the company retaliated by appointing a hostile family member to supervise him. The article explicitly stated that I had fabricated a fake embezzlement scandal, weaponizing my own sister's banking information to blackmail him into silence. It was a completely unhinged lie, but it was incredibly effective. He was capitalizing on the current social climate that automatically paints massive corporations as the villains. By the time my town car pulled up to the corporate headquarters at 8 o'clock, the article had already gone viral across financial networks. I walked onto the executive floor, and the atmosphere was electric with panic. The public relations team was running back and forth with tablets, drafting emergency press releases. The legal team was shouting on the phone with the blog publishers, demanding a retraction. When they saw me step out of the elevator, the entire floor went dead silent. Everyone was staring at me. I was suddenly a massive liability. My assistant rushed over, her face pale. "The chief executive officer wants to see you in his office right now," she whispered. I nodded and walked straight down the glass corridor to the corner suite. The chief executive officer was a ruthless, pragmatic man. He did not care about family drama, he only cared about the stock price. And right now the holding company stock was taking a pre-market dip because of the article. I walked into his massive office. He was standing by the window, rubbing his temples. He did not invite me to sit down. "Nadia, this is an absolute disaster," he barked, turning to face me. "This is exactly why it is a massive conflict of interest to put an executive in charge of an acquisition involving her own relatives. This disgruntled brother-in-law of yours has just handed the media a silver bullet." The board of directors is panicking. They think you let a petty family rivalry jeopardize a multi-million-dollar merger. I stood tall, keeping my hands relaxed at my sides. It is a fabricated smear campaign, sir, I replied calmly. He is trying to distract the public before the authorities indict him for wire fraud. I know he is lying, he snapped, pacing across the room. But the court of public opinion does not care about the truth. They care about the headline. The optics of this are completely toxic. I cannot have you running this integration while you are the center of a corporate blackmail scandal. I am strongly considering suspending you with full pay and bringing in an external firm to handle the Apex transition until this blows over. He was going to sideline me. He was going to let DeAndre win the public relations war. I reached into the pocket of my tailored blazer. I did not argue or raise my voice to defend my integrity. I simply pulled out a small encrypted silver flash drive and placed it gently on the center of his massive glass desk. You will not need an external firm, and you will not need to issue a defensive press release, I said, looking him directly in the eyes. I anticipated he would try something desperate. Last night, shortly before my sister came to my apartment to beg for mercy, DeAndre paid a visit to the corporate parking garage. He waited in the dark for our lead forensic auditor to walk to his car. The chief executive officer stopped pacing. He looked down at the flash drive, his expression shifting from anger to intense curiosity. What is on the drive, Nadia? I smiled a cold, sharp smile. It contains the high-definition security footage from the garage, along with crystal-clear audio from the auditor's microphone, I explained. It is a 10-minute video of DeAndre Washington crying, begging, and ultimately offering our auditor a $50,000 cash bribe to log into the servers and delete the financial evidence. Send this video directly to the journalist who published his fake article. Let us see how much the public loves their whistleblower when they watch him commit felony bribery in full color. The chief executive officer stared at the silver flash drive sitting on his desk. The panic that had gripped the executive floor only moments ago evaporated from his face, replaced by a cold, calculating satisfaction. He picked up the drive, plugged it into his secure terminal, and watched the footage. I stood silently as the undeniable evidence of DeAndre committing a federal offense played out on the screen. The chief executive officer did not suspend me. He immediately instructed the legal department to forward the footage to the federal authorities and the journalists who published the fake article. The smear campaign was dead before lunch, but the corporate victory did not stop the bleeding in my personal life. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, my assistant buzzed my intercom. Her voice was strained, laced with a mix of confusion and alarm. Nadia, she said hesitantly, your father is in the main lobby. He bypassed the reception desk and is demanding to see you. Security is holding him, but he is threatening to make a scene. I sighed, rubbing my temples. Send him up, I instructed. I had successfully defended myself against my mother, my sister, and my brother-in-law. It was only a matter of time before the patriarch of the family arrived to try and force me back into my designated role as the scapegoat. 5 minutes later, my father Thomas walked into my corner office. He looked disheveled. The confident, proud posture he usually carried when boasting about DeAndre was entirely gone. He looked like a man who had not slept, carrying the weight of a massive, impending catastrophe on his shoulders. He closed the heavy oak door behind him and stood in the center of the room. He did not offer a greeting. He did not ask how I was doing after the vicious article his son-in-law had leaked to the press. Nadia, we need to talk. Thomas said, his voice heavy and strained. He paced across the carpet, refusing to make eye contact with me. This entire situation has gotten completely out of hand. Sienna called me this morning crying hysterically. She said you have some sort of video that proves DeAndre tried to bribe an auditor. He tried to bribe an auditor, I corrected him calmly. The video just documents the felony. Sit down, Dad. Thomas ignored the chairs across from my desk. He stopped pacing and finally looked directly at me. His eyes were wide with a desperate, frantic energy. You have to take the fall for this, Nadia. He blurted out, the words tumbling from his mouth in a rush. I stared at him, genuinely stunned. The audacity of the demand was so profound that for a moment I could not process what he was saying. Take the fall for what? I asked, my voice dangerously low. For the embezzlement, For the bribery, for the fake marketing agency. You are a senior executive, Thomas pleaded, stepping closer to my desk. You know how these corporate games work. You can tell your bosses that you authorize those marketing expenses. You can say the bribery attempt was a misunderstanding, a poorly phrased negotiation. You have the power to protect him. If DeAndre goes down for wire fraud, the federal government will freeze all his assets. They will seize everything he owns. Let them, I replied coldly. He stole that money. He deserves to lose everything. You do not understand, Thomas shouted, slamming his hand against the back of the leather chair. He leaned forward, his face pale and sweating. It is not just his assets, Nadia. It is my assets. It is your mother's assets. I leaned back in my chair, suddenly sensing a much darker, much deeper betrayal lurking beneath his panic. What did you do, Dad? I demanded. Thomas swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly. 2 years ago, when DeAndre and Sienna bought that new mansion in the suburbs, the bank would not approve the mortgage based on DeAndre's base salary alone. They needed a guarantor, a co-signer with substantial equity. He paused, clearly struggling to admit his own foolishness. I co-signed the loan, Nadia. I co-signed a $1.5 million mortgage for them. I put up the deed to our house as collateral. The room felt suddenly very cold. You put a lien on your retirement home, I said, piecing together the catastrophic financial puzzle. You risked the house you and Mom have lived in for 30 years to buy a mansion for a man you barely knew. He is my son-in-law, Thomas argued defensively. He is family. He promised me his bonuses would cover the payments. But if his bank accounts are frozen if he goes to prison, the mortgage defaults immediately. The bank will foreclose on their mansion, and then they will come for my house to cover the difference. Your mother and I will be homeless, Nadia. We will lose everything. You have to save us. You have to take the blame at work so he keeps his job and pays the bank. I looked at the desperate man standing in front of me, the man who had cheered when DeAndre uninvited me from Thanksgiving, the man who had called me a disgrace just yesterday. He was now demanding I ruin my own career, face federal prosecution, and go to prison, all to save the house he recklessly gambled away for his golden child. A sickening realization washed over me. I remembered the timeline. 2 years ago. That was exactly when Sienna claimed she was losing her apartment and needed my grandmother's inheritance. I looked at my father, connecting the final dots. The inheritance was not enough for the down payment on a $1.5 million mansion, was it? I asked quietly. Where did you get the rest of the cash, Dad? Thomas looked away, unable to meet my eyes. We used your college fund, he mumbled. The money we saved for your master's degree. We figured you were already making good money, and Sienna needed a stable home to start a family. They had stolen my inheritance and drained my college fund to buy a house they could not afford, and now they wanted my freedom to pay for it. I stood up slowly, looking at my father with absolute chilling clarity. I did not yell. I did not cry. Then you better start packing, I said softly, because I sent the evidence to the FBI 20 minutes ago. Thomas stared at me, his mouth hanging open, the color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow shell of the man who had marched into my office. He finally realized the power dynamic had permanently shifted. I was no longer the obedient daughter he could sacrifice. He turned around and walked out of my office, his shoulders slumped, dragging his feet across the carpet like a defeated man. I watched him leave, feeling completely detached from the situation. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the people who had sacrificed my future for their comfort. I picked up my desk phone and firmly dialed the extension for the head of our corporate legal department. Within 10 minutes, I sat in the secure conference room with 3 senior corporate litigators. I handed them the forensic audit and the security footage. They reviewed the documents with grim efficiency. Wire fraud across state lines immediately triggers a federal response. The lawyers filed an emergency injunction to freeze every financial asset connected to DeAndre and the fraudulent shell company. Because Sienna was the legally registered sole proprietor of that fake marketing agency, her personal banking profiles were instantly flagged as repositories for stolen funds. A federal judge executed the court order before 3 o'clock that afternoon. The financial guillotine had officially dropped. Sienna was completely oblivious to the legal storm. In her entitled mind, DeAndre's crisis was just a temporary inconvenience. Her default coping mechanism for stress was to spend obscene amounts of money. She decided she desperately needed a mental health retreat. Packing a designer bag, she called 2 shallow influencer friends and ordered a car service to O'Hare International Airport. She planned to fly to a luxury wellness resort in Sedona, leaving her husband to deal with his mess. Sienna and her friends strutted up to the Premier Airline counter. She confidently asked the ticketing agent to upgrade all 3 of their coach tickets to first-class suites. The agent gave her the total amounting to over $4,000. Sienna did not flinch. She handed over her platinum credit card with an arrogant flourish. She turned back to her friends, loudly bragging about the deep tissue massages they were going to enjoy. The agent swiped the card. A loud beep echoed from the machine. She tried again. "I am sorry, ma'am," the agent said. "This card is coming up as declined." Sienna rolled her eyes. "Just run it again," she snapped. "The machine is probably broken. I have a massive credit limit." The agent swiped it a third time. The result was exactly the same. "Ma'am, the system is showing a hard lock on this account. Do you have another form of payment?" Sienna snatched the card back, flushing red, as her friends exchanged confused glances. She dug out her debit card and slammed it onto the counter. "Use this one," she demanded. "There is over $100,000 in our primary checking." The agent inserted the debit card. The screen flashed red. The agent looked up with genuine concern. "Ma'am, I cannot process this. Your bank has issued a federal freeze code on this account. It says to contact the authorities immediately. Please step aside so I can help the next customer." Sienna stood frozen. Her friends physically stepped away from her, the embarrassment radiating through the terminal. The illusion of her endless wealth and superiority completely shattered right there in the middle of the crowded ticketing area. Humiliated and defeated, she grabbed her designer bag and ran out of the terminal toward the parking garage, leaving her so-called friends behind. I was sitting at my desk finalizing the Apex Media transition reports when my cell phone rang. It was Sienna. I answered the call and put it on speaker. "You ruined my life," she screamed, her voice cracking with absolute hysteria. "My cards are declined. My friends left me at the airport. I have no money to even pay for a ride home. You are a monster, Nadia. Turn my accounts back on right now." "I did not turn off your accounts, Sienna," I replied calmly. "The federal government did. And by the way, I know about my college fund. Enjoy the consequences of your choices." I ended the call before she could scream another word, cutting off her pathetic tantrum. I dropped my phone back onto the desk and took a deep breath. As soon as the screen went dark, my computer monitor chimed with a high-priority notification. I opened my secure inbox. It was an encrypted email from a special agent at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They had reviewed the forensic audit and the security footage, and they were officially taking over the embezzlement case. The encrypted email from the FBI sat on my monitor, an undeniable confirmation that the situation was no longer a corporate dispute, but a federal criminal investigation. Over the next 48 hours, the reality of the asset freeze began to suffocate my family. I did not answer any of their frantic phone calls or text messages. I let them drown in the terrifying silence of their own consequences. But by Thursday evening, a new tactic emerged. My mother sent a long, overly emotional message to my private email. She begged me to meet the family for a reconciliation dinner at an exclusive French restaurant in downtown Chicago. She claimed they all wanted to apologize to make things right and to heal the divide before it permanently destroyed us. I knew it was a trap. You do not orchestrate a sudden emotional breakthrough in the middle of a federal fraud probe. But I also knew this would be my final opportunity to look them in the eye and officially sever the ties. I put on my sharpest charcoal suit, draped a wool coat over my shoulders, and called a car service. The restaurant was dimly lit and incredibly expensive, the kind of establishment where menus do not have prices and the waiters wear tailored tuxedos. The maitre d' escorted me to a secluded private dining room in the back. As I walked in, the heavy mahogany doors closed silently behind me. Sitting around a circular table were my parents, my sisters Sienna and DeAndre. They looked absolutely miserable. The arrogant glow they had paraded around all year was completely gone. Sienna wore dark sunglasses indoors to hide her swollen eyes. My father looked physically ill, staring down at his empty water glass. DeAndre was sweating through his expensive dress shirt, nervously tapping his fingers against the white linen tablecloth. When I took my seat, the fake pleasantries immediately began. My mother offered a shaky, completely unbelievable smile and tried to compliment my outfit. My father cleared his throat and muttered something about how good it was to see me. I did not order a drink or even look at the menu. I simply folded my hands on the table and waited for the performance to begin. I did not have to wait long. Before the waiter could even pour the water, DeAndre leaned forward. He clasped his hands tightly in front of him and launched into a highly rehearsed, sickeningly emotional speech. Nadia. He began forcing his voice to tremble, as if he were holding back a flood of tears. I have made some terrible mistakes. The pressure of providing for this family, of wanting to give your sister the life she deserves, it clouded my judgment. I lost my way. But we are family. Blood is thicker than corporate policy. We cannot let money tear us apart like this. Your parents are suffering. Sienna is pregnant and terrified. We need to heal. We need to unite and put this unfortunate misunderstanding behind us. He paused, reaching up to wipe away a non-existent tear from his cheek. It was the performance of a desperate man who realized his charisma was no longer working. He reached into his leather portfolio resting on the floor and pulled out a thick stack of stapled legal papers. He slowly slid the documents across the white tablecloth until they rested directly in front of me. I looked down at the paperwork. It was a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement coupled with a complete liability release form. The language was drafted by a desperate defense attorney. It stated that I would immediately retract all allegations of financial misconduct, claim the forensic audit was deeply flawed, and refuse to cooperate with any external or federal investigations regarding Apex Media. I just need you to sign this. Nadia DeAndre pleaded, his voice cracking with artificial emotion. If you sign this liability release, my lawyers can use it to get the bank to unfreeze the accounts. It will show the authorities that this was just an internal company error, not fraud. I promise I will pay back every single cent I borrowed from the marketing budget. Just sign the paper and we can go back to being a happy family. We can save your parents' house. We can save everything. My parents and my sister leaned forward, holding their collective breath. They stared at me with wide, desperate eyes, genuinely believing their emotional manipulation was finally working. They actually thought I was stupid enough to obstruct a federal investigation to save the very people who had sold me out. I did not argue with his flawed legal logic. I simply picked up the heavy legal document and read the absurd terms one last time. I reached into my purse and pulled out my favorite silver fountain pen. I uncapped it smoothly. DeAndre let out a shaky sigh of relief, thinking he had won. I pressed the pen to the signature line. But instead of signing my name, I pressed down hard and wrote 3 words in massive, undeniable black letters across the entire page. See you in court. DeAndre stared at the thick, legal document. His eyes tracked the wet black ink of my fountain pen. The shaky sigh of relief he had just exhaled, caught in his throat, turning into a strangled gasp. He realized I was not the obedient, easily intimidated woman they all assumed I was. The fake tears instantly vanished. The carefully crafted mask of the repentant family man shattered into a million pieces, revealing the vicious, cornered animal underneath. He violently shoved himself away from the table. His heavy oak chair tipped backward and crashed onto the hardwood floor with a deafening thud that echoed through the private dining room. "You miserable witch!" he roared, his voice, completely abandoning any pretense of volume control. He leaned over the table, his face contorted in pure rage, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "I offer you an olive branch. I offer you a chance to save your parents from financial ruin, and you spit in my face. You are nothing but a soulless corporate robot. You have no heart. You are destroying your own blood for what? For a promotion. To look good for your billionaire bosses. His shouting was so loud that the thick mahogany doors could not contain it. I could hear the faint murmur of the main dining room falling completely silent as the wealthy patrons stopped eating to listen to the meltdown. My parents did not tell him to lower his voice. They did not reprimand him for screaming at their daughter in a public place. Instead, they turned their collective fury directly onto me. Thomas slammed his fist down on the white tablecloth, rattling the expensive crystal wine glasses. "DeAndre is right," my father spat, his face red with indignation. "You are completely dead inside, Nadia. A normal human being would want to protect their family, but you are just a cold, calculating machine. You would rather see your own sister homeless than show an ounce of forgiveness." Brenda grabbed a linen napkin and pressed it to her face, unleashing a fresh wave of theatrical tears. "You are a monster," she cried out, glaring at me over the white fabric. "We raised you better than this. You are no daughter of mine. If you walk out that door without signing that paper, you are dead to us. We will never speak to you again." I sat there, absorbing their venom. Their insults did not hurt me. In fact, they only validated every single choice I had made over the last few days. They were so deeply infected by DeAndre and his fraudulent wealth that they were willing to sacrifice my career, my freedom, and my morality just to maintain their illusion of status. I calmly placed the cap back onto my silver fountain pen and slipped it into my purse. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my charcoal suit. I did not raise my voice to match their hysterical screaming. "You cannot fire me from a family I already quit," I said evenly, looking directly at my mother. "And you cannot threaten me with silence when your voices have brought me nothing but grief." Just as I picked up my wool coat, the mahogany doors nervously cracked open. The maitre d' and our assigned waiter stepped into the room, looking alarmed by the shouting. The waiter was holding a sleek black leather billfold. Before I had even arrived, my family had taken the liberty of ordering 2 bottles of vintage French champagne and an array of expensive seafood appetizers, fully assuming they would be celebrating my absolute surrender. "Is everything all right in here?" the maitre d' asked tentatively, eyeing the overturned chair. "Everything is perfectly fine," I replied with a polite smile. "I am leaving, but my family is just wrapping up their evening." I reached into my purse and pulled out a crisp $20 bill. I handed it directly to the waiter. "This is to cover my glass of tap water and for your excellent service tonight. The rest of the table will be taking care of the $850 tab." The waiter nodded, placing the heavy leather billfold directly in front of DeAndre. The screaming stopped instantly. The absolute horror of their financial reality suddenly crashed down upon them. DeAndre stared at the black leather folder as if it were a venomous snake. Sienna gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Their bank accounts were frozen by a federal judge. Sienna had her credit cards declined at the airport just yesterday. They had absolutely zero access to any funds, and my parents had drained their own checking accounts trying to hire a defense attorney. They were sitting in a world-class restaurant with an $800 bill they had absolutely no way of paying. "You cannot do this," DeAndre panicked, patting his empty pockets out of pure reflex. "Nadia, wait." I did not wait. I turned my back on them and walked out of the private dining room. I strolled through the hushed main restaurant, ignoring the stares of the other patrons, and pushed through the heavy glass front doors into the crisp Chicago air. I pulled my wool coat tight against the wind and stepped onto the sidewalk. As I looked up, I stopped in my tracks. 3 dark, unmarked sport utility vehicles were aggressively pulling up to the curb directly in front of the restaurant, their red and blue dashboard lights flashing silently in the night. The federal agents had arrived. I stood on the cold concrete sidewalk, wrapping my wool coat tighter around my shoulders to block the biting wind. I watched as 4 agents in dark windbreakers with the bold yellow letters FBI printed across their backs stepped out of the sport utility vehicles. They did not rush the building with weapons drawn like characters in an action movie. They moved with a terrifying, calm precision that only comes from absolute authority. I stepped aside, blending completely into the dark shadows of the restaurant awning, as 2 of them pushed through the heavy glass doors I had just exited. I had a perfect view through the large front windows of the restaurant. The maitre d' stepped forward, raising his hands to stop them from entering the main dining room. One agent simply flashed a gold badge clipped to his belt, and the resistance crumbled instantly. The restaurant manager pointed a trembling finger toward the back hallway. The agents marched straight past the crowded dining area, weaving purposefully through the tables of wealthy patrons who dropped their expensive silverware to stare in shock. They headed directly for the private dining room. I watched as the heavy mahogany doors were pushed open once again. DeAndre was still standing right where I left him by the table, likely sweating over how to escape paying an $800 dinner bill with frozen bank accounts. When the federal agents walked into the room, all the remaining color drained from his face. He actually took a physical step backward, bumping hard against the expensive wallpaper. The lead agent did not pull out a pair of steel handcuffs. Instead, he reached into his interior jacket pocket and produced a thick sealed manila envelope. I could not hear the exact words through the thick glass window, but the posture was undeniable. DeAndre Washington, you are being served with a federal subpoena for financial records and a summons to appear before a grand jury. Sienna, who had spent the last 2 days conjuring up fake tears to manipulate my emotions, finally experienced genuine, unadulterated terror. The reality of federal agents standing in a luxury restaurant holding court documents was entirely too much for her fragile, carefully curated reality to handle. She grabbed the edge of the white tablecloth, her eyes rolling back into her head and her knees buckled. She fainted for real, hitting the carpeted floor with a soft thud, dragging a crystal water glass down with her. It shattered next to her head, but she did not move. My father dropped to his knees in a panic to check on Sienna, but my mother lost her mind completely. Brenda, severely lacking any self-preservation instincts or basic understanding of federal law, charged directly at the lead agent. Her suburban entitlement convinced her she could simply yell her way out of a federal investigation. She started screaming, pointing her manicured finger right in the agent's face, aggressively waving her arms to shoo him away. I watched the second agent immediately step forward, placing his hand firmly on his utility belt, commanding her to back away. She did not listen. She shoved the agent on the shoulder, actively trying to block them from handing the manila envelope to DeAndre. The agent reacted with lightning speed. He swiftly grabbed her wrist, spinning her around and pinning her arm firmly behind her back. For a brief, glorious second, it looked like Brenda was going to be thrown to the floor, handcuffed and dragged out into a squad car for assaulting a federal officer. Thomas had to leap up from Sienna's side, physically pulling his wife back, begging the agents to forgive her hysterical outburst. DeAndre did not try to fight or defend his mother-in-law. He stood paralyzed, clutching the manila envelope against his chest, as if it were a ticking bomb. The agents gave their final, stern warnings to my parents, turned around, and walked out of the room. They left my family in a state of absolute, undeniable devastation. But the worst part for DeAndre was not just the subpoena. It was the audience. The entire restaurant staff and dozens of wealthy patrons had their cell phones out. They were recording the entire humiliating spectacle. I turned away from the window, walked down the street toward my waiting car service, and went home to sleep peacefully. By the time I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee the next morning, my phone was buzzing wildly with local news alerts. DeAndre thought he could control the narrative by leaking a fake story to an obscure blog, but he severely underestimated the ruthless speed of modern media. The cell phone footage of the FBI confronting him in the restaurant had been sold overnight to a major Chicago news network. The morning headline did not mention me, and it did not mention my company. It read, "Prominent tech executive subpoenaed in massive corporate wire fraud scheme." His social status, his arrogant pride, and his fake influencer lifestyle were instantly obliterated. His social status, his arrogant pride, and his fake influencer lifestyle were instantly obliterated. I spent the entire day at the office fielding congratulatory emails from the board of directors for successfully navigating the Apex Media transition without any public relations fallout for our company. The holding company stock had stabilized, and my position as senior vice president of acquisitions was more secure than ever. I stayed late to finish the final integration reports, enjoying the quiet hum of the empty executive floor. By the time I packed my leather tote bag and took the private elevator down to the underground parking garage, it was past 9 o'clock at night. The garage was dimly lit and completely deserted. The echoing sound of my heels clicking against the concrete was the only noise in the massive underground structure. I walked toward my reserved parking spot where my white Tesla was parked. I pressed the button on my key fob, and the headlights flashed, illuminating the dark corners of the concrete structure. That was when a figure stepped out from behind a thick cement pillar, directly blocking my path to the driver's side door. It was DeAndre. He looked absolutely unhinged. The custom-tailored suits and expensive watches were gone. He was wearing a rumpled dark hoodie and jeans, his eyes bloodshot and darting frantically around the empty garage. He had clearly been waiting in the freezing underground structure for hours, dodging the corporate security patrols. I stopped walking, keeping a safe distance between us. I did not reach for my pepper spray, but I kept my hand firmly inside my bag near my phone. "You are trespassing on corporate property, DeAndre," I said calmly. "If you do not step away from my vehicle right now, I will press the panic button and have security drag you out of here." He did not move. He took a step closer, his breathing heavy and erratic. "I am not leaving until you fix this, Nadia," he growled, his voice vibrating with desperate malice. "You destroyed my life. The federal agents raided my office this afternoon. They took my hard drives, my phone, and my files. My lawyer will not even return my calls. I am facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary, and it is all your fault. It is the consequence of stealing over $100,000. I corrected him, keeping my tone completely flat. "I did not force you to commit wire fraud. Now move." DeAndre let out a dark, manic laugh that echoed off the concrete walls. He reached into the front pocket of his hoodie. For a split second, my heart pounded, but he did not pull out a weapon. He pulled out a large tablet. He tapped the screen aggressively and held it up for me to see. "Look at this," he demanded, shoving the glowing screen toward my face. I squinted in the dim light. Displayed on the tablet were several highly compromising, explicit photographs of what appeared to be me. They were fake, obviously generated using advanced artificial intelligence, but they were incredibly realistic at first glance. They superimposed my face onto illicit scenarios with alarming accuracy. DeAndre smiled, a sick, twisted expression of triumph. "I hired a guy on the dark web to make these today," he sneered. "They look completely real. If you do not log into the corporate servers tonight and permanently delete every single file related to the forensic audit, I will hit send. I will email these photos to your chief executive officer, the entire board of directors, and every single financial news outlet in the country. I will completely destroy your professional reputation. You will be a laughingstock. You will lose your precious senior vice president title by tomorrow morning." He was trying to play a high-stakes game of extortion, fully believing he had finally found my breaking point. He thought I would prioritize my corporate image over seeing him face justice. He waited for me to panic, to cry, or to beg him to stop. Instead, I let out a soft sigh of genuine amusement. I looked at the glowing tablet, then looked back up at his bloodshot eyes. "You really are the dumbest criminal I have ever met, DeAndre," I said, shaking my head. "First of all, the artificial intelligence gave me 6 fingers on my left hand in that second photo. You might want to ask for a refund. And second, you are attempting to extort a corporate officer to destroy evidence in an active federal investigation." "I am not joking, Nadia," he shouted, his finger hovering over the send button on the screen. "Do it or your career is over." I calmly raised my hand and pointed a single finger right past his shoulder. "I am not joking either, DeAndre," I replied. "Take a look behind you." He frowned, slowly turning his head to look at the front of my car. My Tesla was parked less than 10 feet away. The headlights were off, but the small, distinct red light on the front camera was blinking steadily in the dark. "That is Sentry mode," I explained, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet garage. "It activates automatically whenever someone stands too close to the vehicle. It records in brilliant 4K resolution, capturing both video and crystal-clear audio. It just recorded your entire extortion attempt, your confession to hiring someone on the dark web, and your threat to distribute explicit material." DeAndre stared at the blinking red light, the tablet slowly slipping from his trembling hands. "Congratulations, DeAndre," I whispered. "You just added federal blackmail to your indictment." I did not wait for his response. I rolled up my window, locked the doors of my Tesla, and drove up the concrete ramp, leaving him standing alone in the freezing underground garage. I drove straight to the local field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and handed the high-definition footage directly to the lead agent. That stunt effectively sealed his fate. By mid-December, the bitter Chicago winter had settled over the city, and an even colder reality had settled over my family. DeAndre was formally indicted on multiple felony charges, including wire fraud, embezzlement, and federal extortion. He was out on bail, but every single financial account tied to his name, his shell company, and my sister Sienna remained frozen solid by the federal government. The first day of December came and went. The exorbitant mortgage payment for their $1.5 million suburban mansion bounced. In standard financial situations, a bank might offer a brief grace period or a payment plan. But when an account is flagged by federal authorities for corporate fraud, financial institutions do not extend courtesies. They move to protect their assets with aggressive, ruthless speed. DeAndre and Sienna were swiftly issued a formal notice of default, demanding the arrears be paid immediately in certified funds, which, of course, they did not have. The financial avalanche did not stop at their lavish doorstep. Because my father had recklessly co-signed their massive loan and used his own home as collateral, the default triggered a devastating legal mechanism. 2 weeks later, a certified letter arrived at the modest house my parents had lived in for 30 years. A lien was officially being placed on their property. The bank was legally preparing to foreclose on both the luxury mansion and my parents' retirement home to recover the massive outstanding debt. It was a freezing Tuesday evening when my personal phone lit up. The caller identification displayed my mother's name, a sight that usually brought me immediate anxiety. I was sitting comfortably by my fireplace, reviewing revenue projections, enjoying a glass of red wine. I let the phone ring 3 times before I finally pressed the answer button. Nadia. The voice on the other end wailed. It was a sound of pure terror. Brenda was sobbing so violently she could barely form coherent sentences. The arrogant woman who had tried to physically assault me in a corporate lobby was completely gone. She was utterly broken. Nadia. Please do not hang up, Brenda cried, her breathing erratic. The bank sent a certified letter today. They are putting a lien on our house. They are going to take everything we have worked for. Your father is having severe panic attacks. We have no money to hire a defense lawyer. We cannot even afford groceries because our checking account was drained to pay the bail bondsman. I took a slow sip of my wine, staring at the warm flames. What exactly do you want me to do about it, Brenda? I asked, my voice entirely devoid of sympathy. You have to help us, she begged, abandoning whatever pride she had left. We were so unbelievably wrong about DeAndre. He lied to us about everything. Sienna finally admitted she knew about the fake marketing agency. They used us. They used my baby girl, and they used your father's good credit. We are going to be homeless by Christmas. You make so much money, Nadia. You are a senior vice president. You could easily pay the arrears. You could pay off the mortgage and save our house. Please, you are our only hope. I listened to her desperate pleas echoing through the speaker of my phone. I thought about the woman who had happily drained my college fund to buy a house for the sister who despised me. I thought about how quickly they had thrown me away to celebrate a man who bought them luxury dinners with stolen money. You made your choice 5 years ago when you stole my inheritance, I said quietly. And you made your choice again when you banished me from the family holiday to protect a thief. I am not a bank, and I am certainly not your financial savior. Nadia. Please, we are family, she sobbed loudly into the receiver. You cannot leave us out in the cold for the holidays. I leaned back in my leather chair, watching the snow fall outside my windows. Actually, Mother, I can, I replied. I remember very clearly what you told me last month. I would not want to ruin the holiday vibe by paying your bills. I pressed the red button on my screen. The line went dead. The line went dead. I set the phone face down on the mahogany side table and turned my attention back to the crackling fire. I felt no guilt. I felt absolutely nothing for the people who had engineered their own destruction. The rest of the week passed with brutal efficiency. DeAndre was scrambling to find a public defender who would take his complex federal case while my parents were desperately trying to negotiate with a bank that had no interest in their tears. But the most revealing moment of this entire ordeal did not come from my parents or my brother-in-law. It came on a Friday afternoon, right before the holidays, when my office intercom buzzed. My assistant's voice came through the speaker. "Nadia, your sister is in the reception area. She says she has highly confidential information regarding the Apex Media investigation and insists on speaking with you privately." I raised an eyebrow. Sienna showing up at my corporate office instead of my penthouse meant she was treating this as a business transaction. "Send her in," I replied. A moment later, my office door opened. Sienna slipped inside, quickly shutting the heavy oak door behind her as if she were being followed. She looked completely different from the hysterical woman who had fainted in the restaurant. Her hair was pulled back into a severe ponytail, and she was wearing a sharp, dark trench coat. She looked cold, calculated, and entirely focused on survival. She walked over to my desk and dropped a thick, unmarked manila folder right next to my keyboard. "What is this, Sienna?" I asked, leaning back in my leather chair. "This is your golden ticket," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She leaned over my desk, looking at me with wide, intense eyes. "DeAndre is going down. I know that now. The feds took his computers, but they did not find everything. He kept a secondary ledger, a physical book detailing kickbacks he took from local vendors before your company even bought Apex. He hid it in our attic. I found it this morning." I looked at the manila folder, but did not touch it. "And why are you bringing this to me instead of the federal authorities?" Sienna scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "Because the FBI is not going to pay my rent, Nadia. I am not going down with a sinking ship. DeAndre is a fool who got caught. But I still have a life to live. I have a baby on the way. I need capital to relocate, hire a divorce attorney, and start over. I know how much your holding company values clean hands in an acquisition. If you hand this over to your bosses, you look like a corporate hero who uncovered even more hidden liability. I will give you the ledger, but I want a consulting fee. I want $200,000 wired to an offshore account by Monday." I sat in silence, simply staring at the woman standing in front of me. The sheer audacity was almost impressive, but the profound lack of loyalty was absolutely sickening. Just weeks ago, she was broadcasting live on social media, mocking my single status, and praising DeAndre as the ultimate provider. She had happily spent the money he stole, wearing designer clothes and eating truffle turkeys. But the absolute second the money dried up and the consequences arrived, she was ready to sell the father of her children to the highest bidder without a single ounce of hesitation. She possessed no moral compass, only a compass that pointed toward cash. "You are genuinely disgusting, Sienna," I said, my voice laced with pure contempt. "You have absolutely no loyalty to anyone but yourself. You do not care about DeAndre. You do not even care about Mom and Dad losing their house. You just want to secure your luxury lifestyle." "Do not judge me." She snapped, her mask of composure slipping slightly. "You are ruthless in business." "I am just being ruthless in life. Do we have a deal or not?" I slowly reached forward and picked up the manila folder. I did not open it. I simply dropped it directly into the metal trash can beside my desk. "What are you doing?" Sienna gasped, lunging forward slightly. "That is evidence. I do not need your evidence." "Sienna," I replied coldly. "The federal investigators already swept your entire house. If there was a ledger, they already have it. But more importantly, you are entirely delusional if you think you are just an innocent bystander walking away from this sinking ship. What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice trembling as the confidence rapidly drained from her posture. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a crisp, high-resolution copy of the forensic audit. I flipped to the section detailing the fraudulent marketing agency DeAndre used to funnel the stolen corporate funds. I turned the document around and slid it across the desk toward her. "Take a close look at the bottom of that page," I instructed. Sienna looked down at the paper. Her eyes widened in absolute horror. That is the official limited liability company registration for the fake marketing firm, I explained smoothly. DeAndre did not just put your name on it, he needed a signature to open the associated business checking accounts. That is your physical signature, right there on the dotted line, Sienna. You did not just spend the stolen money, you are a legally documented co-conspirator in a massive federal wire fraud operation. The authorities do not pay consulting fees to accomplices, they issue arrest warrants. Sienna stared at the printed document, her mouth opening and closing silently. The ruthless, calculated businesswoman facade completely disintegrated, leaving behind a terrified child. She did not try to bargain anymore. She snatched her designer trench coat, turned around, and practically ran out of my office. I watched the heavy oak door click shut, knowing it was the last time I would ever speak to my sister in a professional setting. The following weeks leading up to the holidays were a masterclass in psychological denial. You would assume that facing federal indictments, massive property liens, and frozen bank accounts would prompt a family to cancel their social engagements. But my family operated on a completely different frequency of reality. For them, appearance was everything. Admitting financial ruin meant admitting defeat to their country club friends and suburban neighbors. So in a spectacular display of absolute delusion, they decided to proceed with their annual extravagant Christmas Eve party at Sienna and DeAndre's $1.5 million mansion. I later learned how they managed to fund this ridiculous charade. Brenda quietly pawned her vintage diamond earrings. Thomas borrowed a significant amount of cash from an old golfing buddy under the guise of a temporary liquidity issue. They hired private caterers, ordered expensive winter floral arrangements, and invited 50 of their most superficial acquaintances. They wanted to project an image of untouchable wealth, pretending the FBI raid was just a minor corporate misunderstanding that would be cleared up any day. They were throwing a lavish gala on the deck of a sinking ship, willfully ignoring the freezing water rushing around their ankles. To ensure their fragile illusion was not shattered, they took one final petty precaution against me. On the morning of Christmas Eve, I received a formal, aggressively worded email from my father. He informed me that I was officially banned from the premises. He stated that my presence was toxic, that I had intentionally destroyed their joy, and that I was no longer considered part of their family. To enforce this ridiculous ban, Thomas actually used a portion of his borrowed cash to hire a private security guard. He stationed a uniformed man at the wrought iron gates of Sienna's driveway, with a printed photograph of my face, instructing him to deny me entry, under threat of immediate police intervention. I read the email while sitting at my kitchen island, sipping a warm cup of coffee. I actually laughed out loud. The sheer absurdity of spending your last available dollars to hire a bouncer for a foreclosed home was deeply poetic. They were guarding a burning building, completely unaware that the foundation had already collapsed. As the sun set over the freezing Chicago skyline on Christmas Eve, I began to prepare for the evening. I did not put on an ugly holiday sweater or a festive dress. I put on a sharp-tailored black suit and a heavy wool overcoat. I stood in front of the mirror in my penthouse, checking my reflection. I looked exactly like what I was, a corporate executive executing a hostile takeover. I walked over to my desk and picked up a thick, heavily stamped manila envelope. This envelope did not contain a Christmas card or a forced apology. It contained legally binding real estate documents. What my family failed to understand was the ruthless speed at which distressed debt is handled in the corporate financial sector. When a massive mortgage goes into default due to federal fraud charges, the bank does not want to sit on the toxic asset. They immediately look to offload the debt to private investment firms. My holding company has a highly aggressive real estate division specifically designed to purchase distressed luxury properties at a premium. I had made a very quiet, very decisive internal recommendation to our real estate director earlier that week. The transaction was completed with remarkable efficiency. I slipped the thick envelope into my leather briefcase and grabbed my car keys. I took the elevator down to the garage and climbed into my Tesla. The drive out to the affluent suburbs was quiet and dark, the snow falling gently against the windshield. I thought about the security guard standing out in the freezing cold holding a printed picture of my face. I thought about my mother pouring champagne and my father laughing with his friends, pretending their entire world was not actively collapsing around them. They explicitly banned me from attending their party as a guest. They told the security guard to turn away Nadia, the estranged sister. But I was not driving to the mansion as a sister, a daughter, or a guest. I was arriving as the authorized legal representative of the property's brand new owner. I was arriving as the authorized legal representative of the property's brand new and absolute owner. When DeAndre defaulted on his $1.5 million mortgage, the bank immediately flagged the asset for foreclosure. Banks despise holding on to toxic, high-value properties linked to federal fraud investigations. They want to offload that bad debt as quickly as possible to recoup their losses. I did not use company funds for this transaction. I used my own personal money. I contacted the bank's asset management division earlier in the week and made them an offer they could not legally refuse. I purchased the entire debt on Sienna and DeAndre's massive mansion at a 10% premium above market value. I paid in cash, clearing the transaction instantly. By doing so, the bank transferred the deed and all associated foreclosure rights directly to a private limited liability company that I personally own and control. My family thought the faceless corporate bank was coming to take their house. They had absolutely no idea that the bank had already quietly sold the house to me. I was now the sole legal entity holding the deed, which meant I was the one executing the immediate foreclosure and eviction. The tires of my Tesla crunched softly against the fresh snow as I turned onto the exclusive tree-lined street of their suburban neighborhood. Even from a block away, I could see the glow of the ridiculous Christmas Eve party. The long, circular driveway was packed with high-end luxury vehicles belonging to their country club friends and superficial acquaintances. I even saw a hired valet attendant shivering near a portable heater. I could hear the faint sound of a live jazz trio drifting through the freezing night air. They were drinking vintage champagne, eating expensive catered food, and laughing inside a house that legally belonged to me. I slowly pulled my car up to the closed wrought iron security gates blocking the entrance to the driveway. Standing right in the center of the driveway, shivering in a heavy black winter coat, was the private security guard my father had hired with borrowed money. He held a clipboard in one hand and a heavy-duty flashlight in the other. As my headlights illuminated him, he raised his hand, signaling me to stop. I put the car in park and stepped out into the freezing wind, leaving the engine running. I buttoned my tailored wool overcoat and walked calmly toward the gate, feeling completely detached from any lingering sense of familial obligation. The guard shined his flashlight toward my face, temporarily blinding me. He looked down at the clipboard which held the printed photograph my father had provided. "Mom," he said, his voice stern but shivering slightly from the cold. "I am going to have to ask you to turn your vehicle around and leave the premises immediately. You are on the restricted access list. The hosts have made it explicitly clear that you are not welcome here under any circumstances, and I am authorized to call the local police if you attempt to trespass on this property." I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice or show any frustration. I simply reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the thick, heavily stamped manila envelope. I opened it and extracted the official notarized property deed, complete with the state seal and the transfer of ownership documentation. I held the heavy parchment out toward him. "I understand Thomas told you to keep me out," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and authoritative. "But Thomas does not own this property anymore, and neither does his son-in-law. The bank executed a distressed asset sale 48 hours ago." The guard frowned slowly, lowering his flashlight. He hesitantly reached through the iron bars and took the documents. He scanned the bold legal text, his eyes widening as he read the immediate transfer of deed and the active foreclosure notice. He realized very quickly that he was standing in the middle of a massive legal and familial war. "You were hired to protect this property on behalf of the legal owner," I continued, stepping closer to the wrought iron gate. "As you can clearly read on that notarized deed, the legal owner of this estate is now my private holding firm. Which means, as of this exact moment, I am the one paying your hourly rate." The guard looked from the paper to my face, completely stunned by the sudden shift in power. He swallowed hard, handing the paperwork back to me. "And since I am your employer," I said, my voice cutting sharply through the freezing winter wind, I am officially terminating your services. You are fired immediately. Please step away from my gate. The security guard did not argue. He unclipped his radio, grabbed his thermos from the brick pillar, and practically sprinted down the snowy sidewalk toward his own vehicle parked down the street. I slipped the heavy notarized deed back into my leather briefcase, walked back to my Tesla, and drove straight through the open wrought iron gates. The long driveway was lined with hundreds of glowing luminaries, casting a warm, festive light against the fresh snow. I pulled my car right up to the front entrance, bypassing the line of luxury vehicles waiting for the valet. The young attendant rushed over, waving his hands, and telling me I could not park in the fire lane. I ignored him, locked my doors, and walked up the wide stone steps toward the grand double doors of the mansion. I did not bother ringing the doorbell. It was a party, and the doors were unlocked to accommodate the constant flow of guests and catering staff. I pushed the heavy oak doors open and stepped into the massive two-story foyer. The sheer extravagance of the decorations was nauseating considering the financial reality behind them. Thick garlands of fresh cedar and imported white roses cascaded down the sweeping spiral staircase. A hired coat check attendant stepped forward to take my wool overcoat, but I waved him away. I wanted to keep my sharp black suit covered until the perfect moment. I walked purposefully down the marble hallway, following the sound of clinking glasses, live jazz music, and loud, obnoxious laughter. I stopped at the arched entryway of the sunken living room. The space was packed with over 50 guests, all dressed in high-end cocktail attire, completely oblivious to the fact that they were drinking champagne in a crime scene. At the far end of the room stood a massive 12-foot Christmas tree covered in crystal ornaments. Standing directly in front of it was DeAndre. He had a microphone in one hand and a flute of vintage champagne in the other. He was in the middle of giving a loud, boastful toast to the crowd. "This year has tested us," DeAndre announced, his voice oozing with fake humility and practiced charm. "As many of you know, when you reach a certain level of success in the corporate world, you attract jealousy. You attract haters who want nothing more than to tear down what you have built with your own two hands. But my beautiful wife Sienna and I have learned that true wealth is not just about financial portfolios. It is about resilience. It is about the unbreakable bond of family standing together against the bitter, jealous individuals who try to sabotage your joy. So raise your glasses to overcoming the haters and to a prosperous new year." The guests murmured in agreement, raising their crystal flutes in a synchronized display of wealthy solidarity. I decided that was the perfect moment to make my presence known. I stepped down into the sunken living room. My black leather heels clicked sharply against the imported hardwood floor. The guests standing near the entryway parted slightly, turning their heads to look at the newcomer who was decidedly not dressed for a festive holiday gala. Sienna was the first person to actually recognize me. She was standing next to the fireplace holding a plate of catered appetizers. When she saw my face, she let out a sharp, audible gasp, dropping a silver fork onto the floor. DeAndre looked over to see what had startled his wife. His arrogant smile completely vanished. He lowered the microphone, the feedback whining briefly before cutting out entirely. The sudden tension in his body language was so obvious that the live jazz trio playing in the corner intuitively stopped playing. The cheerful holiday music abruptly died, leaving the massive room echoing with a heavy, suffocating silence. 50 heads turned to stare at me. My mother, Brenda, pushed her way to the front of the crowd. Her face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, keeping her voice low but incredibly sharp. "I told the security guard to keep you off this property. You need to leave right now before you ruin this evening for everyone." I did not look at her. I did not acknowledge her existence. I walked right past her, moving smoothly through the crowd of confused guests. I walked directly toward the massive stone fireplace, casually admiring the expensive floral arrangements lining the mantel. "Beautiful decorations," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "It really is a shame you will not be taking any of this with you." DeAndre puffed out his chest, stepping forward to reassert his dominance in front of his wealthy friends. "Nadia, I am warning you," he growled. "Get out of my house." I turned to face him, a cold smile forming on my lips. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a crisp, brightly colored legal document. I am afraid you are mistaken, DeAndre, I replied loudly. This is my house, and I brought you a gift. I stepped forward and pressed the official notice of foreclosure and immediate eviction flat against his chest, forcing him to take it right in front of all 50 guests. DeAndre reflexively grabbed the brightly colored legal document as I pressed it against his chest. He held it up, his bloodshot eyes scanning the bold, capitalized letters at the top of the page. The collective gasp from the 50 guests sucked the remaining warmth right out of the room. People began whispering urgently to one another, their champagne flutes suddenly frozen in midair. This is a joke, DeAndre stammered, his voice lacking its usual booming confidence. He looked around at his friends, forcing a weak, frantic laugh. She typed this up on her computer. It is a fake document. She is just trying to embarrass me because she is jealous of our success. He gripped the top of the heavy parchment and aggressively tried to tear it in half, his knuckles turning white from the strain. But legal notices of this magnitude are printed on thick, tear-resistant cardstock, specifically to prevent this kind of dramatic destruction. He struggled with it awkwardly for a few humiliating seconds, his face turning a deep shade of crimson before crumpling it into a tight ball and throwing it onto the hardwood floor. You are completely unhinged, Nadia, he shouted, stepping toward me with his fists clenched. I am calling the police. I am having you arrested for trespassing and harassment right now. I did not back away. I kept my posture perfectly straight and offered him a polite, chilling smile. You do not need to call the police, DeAndre, I replied calmly. I brought them with me. I turned my head slightly and gave a subtle nod toward the massive arched entryway. Heavy, synchronized footsteps echoed on the marble floor of the hallway. 2 uniformed deputies from the local sheriff department stepped down into the sunken living room. Their presence was undeniable, their heavy utility belts and stern expressions instantly commanding the attention of every single person in the room. The guests physically recoiled, stepping back to clear a path. The lead deputy, a tall man with graying hair and an absolutely no-nonsense demeanor, walked directly over to the crumpled document on the floor. He picked it up, smoothed it out, and looked directly at DeAndre. Mr. Washington, the deputy said, his voice deep and authoritative. This is a legally binding notice of foreclosure and immediate eviction. The title of this estate was officially transferred 48 hours ago. As of this moment, you are unlawfully occupying private property owned by this lady holding firm. Sienna let out a high-pitched wail, covering her face with her hands. My mother, Brenda, stood completely frozen, her mouth open in silent horror. The illusion was dead. The wealthy friends they had tried so desperately to impress were now actively witnessing their absolute financial ruin. The deputy turned his attention to the crowd of shocked partygoers. Ladies and gentlemen, the deputy announced loudly, making sure his voice carried to the back of the massive room. This property has been legally seized. The new owner has requested that the premises be cleared. If your name is not on the original lease or deed, you are considered a non-resident. You have exactly 10 minutes to collect your belongings and vacate the property. Anyone remaining inside the house after that time will be arrested and charged with criminal trespassing. The reaction was instantaneous. Superficial country club friends are not the kind of people who stick around to offer emotional support during a police raid. They protect their own reputations above all else, and being associated with an active foreclosure was social suicide. Absolute chaos erupted in the living room. Women grabbed their designer purses and hiked up their expensive evening gowns, practically running toward the coat check in the front foyer. Men shouted into their cell phones, frantically calling for their rides or demanding the valet bring their cars around immediately. Wait, DeAndre pleaded, holding his hands out as his so-called friends pushed past him. Guys, please, it is just a misunderstanding with the bank. Do not leave. Nobody listened. Nobody even made eye contact with him. They treated him like he was radioactive. In less than 5 minutes, the lavish Christmas Eve gala was reduced to a stampede of terrified socialites fleeing a sinking ship. The caterers abandoned their stations, leaving trays of expensive appetizers sitting on the counters, and hurried out the back service doors. I stood quietly near the fireplace, watching my parents get swept up in the frantic exodus. Thomas grabbed Brenda by the arm, dragging her toward the front door without even looking back at their golden son-in-law. They were running away to save their own remaining shreds of dignity. As the last few guests squeezed through the front doors and spilled out into the freezing winter night, the flashing blue lights of the sheriff cruisers were suddenly joined by a different set of vehicles. 3 dark, unmarked sport utility vehicles aggressively swerved into the driveway, blocking the fleeing valet cars. Men and women in dark windbreakers stepped out into the snow. They were not local police enforcing an eviction. They were federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They bypassed the panicked guests and marched straight through the open front doors, their badges gleaming under the festive porch lights. They did not care about the house or the eviction notice. They were here because the grand jury had just handed down the official indictments for the massive wire fraud, and they were not going to wait until Christmas morning to make their move. They did not care about the house or the eviction notice. They were here because the grand jury had just handed down the official indictments for the massive wire fraud, and they were not going to wait until Christmas morning to make their move. 4 federal agents walked purposefully past the local sheriff deputies, their heavy boots thudding against the imported hardwood floor. The lead agent, a tall woman with a sharp and uncompromising expression, walked straight up to DeAndre. She did not hand him another manila envelope or ask for a polite conversation in a private room. She reached to her heavy utility belt and unclipped a pair of steel handcuffs. DeAndre Washington, the lead agent, announced, her voice echoing clearly off the high ceilings of the lavishly decorated room. "We are executing a federal arrest warrant issued by the United States District Court. You are being charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and criminal extortion. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." The remaining color completely drained from DeAndre's face. The arrogant, boastful man who had just been holding a microphone and lecturing a room full of wealthy friends about overcoming haters was entirely gone. He was replaced by a terrified, trembling shell. He instinctively took a step backward, bumping hard into the massive 12-foot Christmas tree. Several expensive crystal ornaments fell and shattered on the floor around his designer shoes. "Wait," DeAndre stammered, holding his trembling hands up defensively. "There is a massive mistake here. I have a lawyer. You cannot do this right now. It is Christmas Eve. The federal government does not observe holiday hours for active felony indictments," the agent replied coldly. "Turn around immediately." When DeAndre hesitated, 2 other agents stepped forward, grabbed him firmly by the shoulders, and forcefully spun him around. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists was the loudest sound in the entire house. Seeing her husband physically restrained completely broke whatever fragile grip Sienna still had on reality. She had spent weeks denying the severity of the situation aggressively, hoping it would somehow magically disappear. But the sight and sound of those steel cuffs shattered her delusion. She let out a guttural, terrifying scream that tore through the silent living room. She did not run to comfort her husband or ask the federal agents for an explanation. In her twisted, entitled mind, she desperately needed someone to blame, and her eyes locked instantly onto me. "You did this!" Sienna shrieked, her face contorted in pure, unadulterated rage. "You ruined my entire life!" She lunged across the sunken living room, her hands curled into claws aiming directly for my face. I did not flinch or even take a step back. Before she could get within 5 feet of me, the local sheriff deputy who had read the eviction notice stepped smoothly into her path. He grabbed her by the arms easily, overpowering her frantic struggles, and pushed her firmly back against the wall. "Ma'am, you need to calm down right now, or you will be leaving this property in handcuffs too," the deputy warned her sternly. Sienna thrashed against his grip, sobbing hysterically, but she was entirely powerless. She slid down the wall, collapsing into a pathetic heap on the floor, ruining her expensive designer cocktail dress. I looked over at my parents. Thomas and Brenda were standing near the arched entryway, completely paralyzed by shock. Their faces were ashen, their eyes wide with absolute horror. They were actively watching the literal destruction of everything they valued. The golden son-in-law, they had blindly worshipped the man they had sacrificed my college fund and their own retirement home to protect, was standing in front of his extravagant Christmas tree like a common criminal. Their social standing, their arrogant pride, and their entire suburban identity were burning to ashes right in front of them. The lead federal agent stood firmly next to DeAndre and began to recite the words that signaled the absolute end of his fake empire. "You have the right to remain silent," she stated clearly, the Miranda warning cutting sharply through Sienna's muffled sobs. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." As the agent finished reading his rights, they began to march him toward the front doors. DeAndre dragged his feet, his head hanging low in ultimate defeat. As he passed by the stone fireplace where I was standing, he stopped. The agents paused for a brief second, allowing him to look up at me. His eyes were wide with pure panic and desperation. The arrogant sneer was completely gone, replaced by the pathetic pleading of a broken man. "Nadia, please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You are a senior vice president. You know the board of directors. Tell them it is a corporate misunderstanding. Tell them you made a mistake with the audit. Please stop this." I looked at the man who had tried to banish me from my own family, who had tried to extort me with fake photographs, and who had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund a lifestyle he did not earn. I took a small step forward, leaning in slightly, so only he could hear my final words. "Happy holidays, DeAndre." I whispered perfectly calmly. I brought the vibe. He stared at me, the final remnants of his manufactured pride crumbling into dust. The lead agent pulled him away, guiding him out the grand double doors and into the freezing winter night. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the snow as he was placed into the back of a dark sport utility vehicle. I stood by the fireplace watching the tail lights fade down the long driveway. The mansion, once echoing with the obnoxious laughter of fake friends, was now completely silent, except for Sienna's pathetic sobbing against the hallway wall. The ultimate collapse of their fraudulent empire had finally concluded. The days following Christmas Eve were a swift and brutal execution of justice. DeAndre appeared before a federal judge for his arraignment hearing. His court-appointed public defender made a desperate plea for bail, citing his pregnant wife and his ties to the local community. But the federal prosecutor was entirely prepared. They presented the Sentry Mode video from my Tesla showcasing his explicit attempt to blackmail a corporate officer and tamper with federal evidence. They also present the financial records of his offshore shell companies and the millions of dollars still completely unaccounted for. The judge took one look at the overwhelming evidence of his flight risk and slammed the wooden gavel down hard. Bail was strictly denied. The golden boy of our family spent his holiday season locked inside a high-security federal detention center wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit instead of a custom-tailored cashmere sweater. Without DeAndre and his stolen money to shield them, the brutal financial reality crashed down on the rest of the family. The bank did not hesitate or offer any leniency. Since my father had recklessly used his primary residence as collateral for the $1.5 million mansion, the default triggered an automatic seizure of his assets. The very week after Christmas, Thomas and Brenda received their own formal notice of eviction. They had to pack 30 years of memories, expensive furniture, and suburban pride into a rented moving truck. The comfortable, wealthy retirement they had meticulously planned was completely wiped out. They were forced to move into a cramped run-down one-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city, draining whatever tiny pension my father had left, just to cover the basic security deposit. Sienna was left entirely destitute. Her high society friends had blocked her number the second the federal agents raided the Christmas party. Without access to her frozen bank accounts, her platinum credit cards, or her husband's stolen wealth, she had absolutely nowhere to go. She could not move in with our parents because their new apartment barely had enough room for the two of them. The glamorous online influencer who once bragged to thousands of followers about $400 truffle turkeys was forced to pack her remaining clothes into heavy plastic garbage bags. She used the last of her hidden emergency cash to rent a room at a dingy, dimly lit motel right off the interstate highway. Her new reality consisted of peeling yellow wallpaper and the constant deafening roar of passing semi-trucks, a far cry from the private dining rooms in Aspen. Her social media accounts went completely dark. They had all hit absolute rock bottom. And predictably, when they had exhausted every other option and realized nobody else was coming to save them, they tried to crawl back to the very person they had spent a lifetime treating like garbage. It was a quiet Sunday morning in January. I was sitting at my kitchen island sipping a fresh cup of coffee and reading a financial journal when my phone vibrated on the marble counter. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. I did not answer. I simply let it ring until it went to voicemail. A few minutes later, an audio message appeared on my screen. It was exactly 5 minutes and 20 seconds long. I pressed play and put the phone on speaker. Brenda's voice filled my peaceful kitchen, thick with tears and absolute desperation. "Nadia, please," she sobbed loudly. "I am begging you to call me back. Your father and I have lost everything. We are sleeping on an inflatable mattress in a terrible neighborhood. Sienna is terrified and alone in that awful motel. We were so incredibly wrong. We were blinded by the money and we treated you horribly. I am so sorry for favoring her all these years. I am so sorry for pushing you away. Please, you have that massive penthouse. You have a guest room. Just let us stay with you for a few months until we can get back on our feet. We are family, Nadia. You are my daughter. Please do not abandon us in the cold." I listened to her desperate, pathetic apologies for exactly 60 seconds. I did not feel a single drop of pity, remorse, or familial obligation. Her tears were not born out of genuine love or a sudden realization of her deep failures as a mother. She was only apologizing because she was entirely out of money and out of options. She simply wanted the comfort of my luxury penthouse, not the genuine healing of our severed relationship. I reached out and tapped the glass screen of my phone. I did not even let her finish her sentence. I deleted the voicemail. Then, with 3 simple clicks, I permanently blocked her number. I did the exact same for Thomas, and I did the exact same for Sienna. The toxic rot was finally excised from my life. Exactly 6 months passed since that quiet Sunday morning. The brutal Chicago winter eventually melted away, giving way to a bright and incredibly promising spring. But I was not in Chicago to watch the seasons change. I was sitting on the sun-drenched wooden deck of a private overwater bungalow in the Maldives. The crystal-clear water of the Indian Ocean lapped gently against the stilts beneath me. There were no ringing cell phones, no frantic emergency emails, and absolutely no family group chats demanding my money. There was only the soothing sound of the ocean breeze and the profound peace that comes from finally choosing yourself. I took a slow sip of my iced espresso, looking out at the endless horizon. A lot had changed in those 6 short months. Following the flawless execution of the Apex Media integration and the swift removal of the toxic elements within their regional management, the holding company experienced a massive surge in quarterly profits. The board of directors did not just thank me for my discretion and ruthless efficiency during a public crisis. They rewarded me immensely. 2 weeks before my trip to the Maldives, I was officially promoted from senior vice president to a full equity partner at the firm. I was 34 years old, financially independent, and standing at the pinnacle of my career. The contrast between my daily reality and the grim reality my family had tried to force upon me was staggering. For my entire life, they tried to convince me that I was less than them. They painted me as the bitter woman who would never amount to anything simply because I refused to play their superficial games. They demanded absolute loyalty, using the concept of family as a weapon to shield themselves from the devastating consequences of their horrific actions. But family loyalty should never be a suicide pact. It should never require you to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. I occasionally heard brief updates through the corporate legal grapevine back in the city. DeAndre had officially pled guilty to multiple federal charges in a desperate attempt to reduce his sentence. He was currently serving a 10-year term in a federal penitentiary, completely stripped of his arrogant swagger. Sienna and my parents were still crammed into that tiny run-down apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city, working minimum wage retail jobs just to keep the electricity turned on. They had lost their luxury mansion, they had lost their comfortable retirement, and they had lost their golden child. But most importantly, they had lost their favorite punching bag. They had lost me. Cutting ties with your own flesh and blood is never an easy decision to make. Society constantly tells us that blood is thicker than water, that we must forgive and forget, and that we owe our parents our endless devotion simply because they brought us into this world. But mutual respect is a two-way street. When the people who are supposed to protect you actively choose to exploit you, walking away is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that made you sick. You cannot grow while being anchored to selfish people who are determined to drag you down to their level. I set my espresso cup down on the glass table and looked directly forward, feeling the warm sun on my face. If you are watching this right now, and you are sitting in a childhood bedroom or a quiet apartment, feeling the suffocating weight of a family that constantly belittles your achievements and drains your emotional energy, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Your worth is not determined by the people who are too blind to see it. You do not owe your success, your peace, or your hard-earned money to anyone who uses your love as a bargaining chip. It is terrifying to walk away from the only family you have ever known. The guilt will try to creep in during the quiet moments. But the incredible freedom that waits for you on the other side of that guilt is worth every single tear. You have the power to build a life so beautifully secure and so entirely your own that their incredibly toxic opinions simply cannot ever reach you anymore. You can confidently build your own impregnable fortress of peace. They thought I was just the scapegoat they could lock out in the cold. But when you own the building, you control the thermostat. If your family made you feel small to make themselves look big, what did you do about it? Let me know in the comments. Like and subscribe for more. The story of Nadia highlights a painful but profoundly necessary truth about human relationships. Blood relation does not automatically entitle someone to your unconditional loyalty, especially when that loyalty is used as a weapon. For generations, society has pushed the narrative that family is everything, and that we must always forgive our relatives. However, as this story brutally illustrates, toxic individuals often weaponize this exact sentiment to escape the consequences of their own destructive actions. Nadia's parents and sister expected her to sacrifice her career, her financial security, and her freedom simply to protect a man who committed federal fraud. They treated her like a disposable asset when they were on top, yet demanded she act as their ultimate savior the moment their fraudulent empire collapsed. The most vital lesson to extract from this drama is that establishing absolute non-negotiable boundaries is not an act of cruelty, it is the ultimate act of self-preservation. When people consistently demonstrate that your worth to them is entirely conditional based only on what you can provide, pay for, or endure, you have every right to permanently close the door. Nadia's true victory was not just the brilliant corporate checkmate that exposed DeAndre. It was her realization that she did not need the approval of people who actively tried to destroy her. True empowerment happens the moment you accept that you are allowed to evict toxic individuals from your life, regardless of the DNA you share. You cannot heal, thrive, or find genuine peace in the exact same environment that was designed to keep you small. If you found value in this lesson, please share this reflection with someone who might need the courage to set their own boundaries, and leave a comment below about a time you chose your own peace over toxic loyalty.